You are on the brink. You are on the brink. You are on the brink.
People don't read ads. They read what interests them. Sometimes it's an ad.
This quote from the mid-century propagandist Howard Gossage feels somehow more relevant in today's cultural landscape than it did in the 60s. Gossage might be a little more under the radar than his Golden Age contemporaries like David Ogilvy, Bill Bernbach, and Leo Burnett, but that's part of his cool factor. He ran his agency out of an old firehouse in San Francisco and focused more on social consciousness, both in his approach as a propagandist and in a lot of the clients he took on. He might be best known for his unconventionally interactive approaches to advertising that often felt like an analog version of content marketing, and maybe even social media, a half-century before we defined these terms. There are countless examples of creative ingenuity in Gossage's work, but where his contributions to the field of advertising become truly timeless is within his philosophy.
Advertising is propaganda, marketing is exploitation. Propaganda simply means the dissemination of instruction and information by an interested party. Exploitation merely means the follow-up that makes it pay off. If a fellow tells a girl he loves her, that is propaganda. If he kisses her, that is exploitation.
These reflections point to a broader critique of the American advertising industry's practices and its own delusions. Gossage argued for ethical, creative, and effective advertising that respects the consumer and contributes to a healthy and informative public discourse. As Jeff Goodby put it, Gossage treated advertising as something that involved people at the upper levels of their capabilities, that searched for the audience's highest common denominator, rather than its lowest. Our special guest is advertising veteran and copywriter Justin Oberman. A deeply invested student in the teachings of Howard Gossage, he's here to guide us on a journey as we unpack the ads he made and the philosophy that guided them. This is Propaganda.
How long ago did you get into advertising?
Late in life, actually, in my 30s. So maybe 15 years ago.
And what drew you to it?
Everything I did everywhere else was that. Like I always ended up, like I was even working in my family business and my father was just, oh, you're really good at this marketing thing. Why don't you run the marketing? You're really good at, and then it just was this constant. And then, so I was just like, why don't I just do this? It's so, I just became self-taught. I learned the way Ogilvy did. I remember somebody gave me his book. I read it. And he basically is like, yeah, I started advertising when I was 38 and I just read all the books. So I just read all the books and taught myself. And it's not the easiest way to break in, but
yeah,
it certainly gives you a perspective.
Yeah. I know that's part of what attracted us to you and why we reached out to you, because you have a pretty big LinkedIn following. I think like 36,000 people, something like that.
So weird. Yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like a lot of LinkedIn influencers, if you want to call them that, have just like a lot of vapid, I always call it fortune cookie wisdom, just like nonsense. And you're like almost like a historian where a lot of what you post is like, here's a deep dive into, a book I read or whatever. And I thought that was a breath of fresh air on that platform for sure, and really good alignment with what we're trying to do here, which is like kind of looking at the past a little bit to learn.
Yeah, well, I have a good metaphor for that, but I'll save it for when. Well, I'll tell it to you, and then we have to bring it up again. So, Marshall McLuhan, who Howard Gossage discovered, Marshall McLuhan, in his early career, used to criticize people a lot by saying that people are like driving into the future by looking into the rearview mirror. And he was asked in an interview about that. And he goes, I changed my mind about that, because one day I was driving in the rearview mirror and I realized that you don't look into the rearview mirror to see what you've passed. You look into a rearview mirror to see what's coming. And so, yes, it's important to look in front of you. But if you really want to know what's coming, you should look behind you.
As someone who it seems like is kind of a student of the rear view mirror of advertising and really enjoying being able to study this very rich history that we have, I've been digging really deeply into propaganda in the 20th century for like probably a year or two now. And I find it so engaging and so exciting. And I'm constantly writing down all of these notes. And then I show up to my job at a modern ad agency where I have to make a set of display ads or a billboard, or a client comes with a very, very, specific thing. Throughout your career, I guess, have you noticed a conflict between things you learn that you want to apply and what you're literally doing? And how do you close that gap?
I don't think that I think that the three of us in this room are very uncommon in that problem, because I think that most people in this industry don't study it or the history of it. And I really just think that it's really just a matter of where you are in the structure of that agency. So if you're on a decision-making level that's facing the client, then sure, you have an opportunity to persuade the client about something that you've learned or that you're learning. I wouldn't necessarily put it that way. I just read this in a book. Let's try it. But, it's, but certainly, like, you are a conglomerate of everything that you read and think. And if you're in the position to do it, great. If not, the best you can do is just propose the idea during the brainstorm and see if the person above you gets it or doesn't get it. And that's probably a good indication, too, of whether you should stick around. But every once in a while, someone will listen.
Yeah, I think that's something that we often find ourselves like we're pretty good at selling our ideas. And a lot of that is because we're always trying to bring intention behind all of our decisions. But sometimes that intention doesn't have a good business justification. It's more the magic of creativity that becomes harder to sell up chains. And I think I feel like I'm on a journey right now to reframe the way people see us. Like for me, I'm like, okay, we're here to get you attention. Like, let's reframe it through the lens of attention. And if your goal is to get attention, not to do marketing, to me, that opens new doors and new possibilities as far as letting the creatives cook, right? And letting them come up with ways that actually disrupt brain pattern recognition and people will actually like notice and pay attention to. But yeah, I think the spirit of Malcolm's question was definitely coming from a place of, I think you often see the hierarchies and the bureaucracies of the business world, where even if your direct client advocate that you're working with in the trenches is on the same level as you, then they got to sell it up their chain. And there's just so many cooks, right? And it becomes like 90% of the job is just selling it. And only 10% is actually like coming up with the work.
Well, yeah. And Howard was very particular about his clients. Like he even would fire them. Like one time he worked for a wine company. The rumor is, the way that he tells it is that he called up the CEO of the wine company. He says, I'm firing you. Why? I don't like your advertising. And he goes, but you do our advertising. He goes, exactly. I can't stand it anymore. And he had that luxury. And also it was very clear the kind of work that he did. So he attracted a certain type of client.
From all of your studying of Gossage and kind of his career and philosophy, what do you see as his perspective on propaganda as it relates to commerce?
Right. So he it's a very good question. So this is one of his less famous, but more famous, but somewhat famous quotes. He says, advertising is propaganda and marketing is exploitation. And he says those two things, it sounds dirty, those words, but they're not. So I think that he had probably studied a little Bernays to understand that, right? That the word propaganda is not a dirty word. And what he more or less meant was that advertising to him, the advertising part separated from marketing. Well, I think he said when a guy says "I love you," that's propaganda. When he kisses you, when he kisses the girl, that's exploitation, right? To be honest, I've always had a very tough time understanding these like 3 pages that are in the book of Gossage where he's talking about this. But I think that he's breaking it down to very simple terms where he says like the role of advertising, not marketing, advertising. It's the propagation of an idea to promote, and it's the saying part. It's not necessarily the persuasion part, but it's the saying part, and the marketing is the part that kind of takes care of the rest. And so I think he meant it in somewhat simplistic terms, but really most people wouldn't say advertising is propaganda. Like Edward Bernays for sure would say advertising is very different than propaganda. So for Howard to say that advertising is propaganda really is uniquely Gossage, because he's one of the very few people who's able to use advertising as propaganda successfully. Because usually good propaganda, right? Like the one word, if you use Edward Bernays, one word, indirection, right? It's all about indirection with him. Look here, look here. Advertising is not about indirection. It's very much about look at me, look over here, you know? And so what Howard was able to do was use that as a type of indirection to then create, you know, buzz and whatever. So he doesn't actually talk about this in the book of Gossage, but there's a letter that he wrote to somebody, Baron Musi, where he basically explains his technique and calls it the ad platform technique. And there's two parts of it. The first part is interactive advertising before anyone was doing it. His style, what he would do is he would write the ad and make it interactive. So people would use the coupon to respond. And then based on the responses, he would create another ad. So it was this back and forth thing, right? And then another ad and another ad. And so it was just sort of constant conversation with the audience. The audience loved it. And he knew his audience. That's why he mostly only created ads in the New Yorker, because that's the type of audience that would intellectually like to play this type of game. The other part of it is that the goal of his ad was always earned media. He wanted his clients to spend as little on advertising as possible. So he would create an ad for the sole purpose of the ad being to stir up commotion, people talking or whatever, word of mouth. Back then, today it would be on social media, get shared. So he'd create the ad and then have the world do the rest of the job for him. Like him or don't like him, like it's sort of a Donald Trump strategy. I'm just going to say things and I'm going to get free time, you know? And so there's a very Edward Bernays aspect to that, right? Especially because what he would do, right? Like, so for Fina gas stations, Fina gas stations was opening up gas stations all over Texas. And they also wanted to know where a lot of families were, and they could have spent millions of dollars on doing a study in this or whatever. But they needed to launch. And Howard said, I'm going to wrap this all up into one thing. And so what he did is he had a guy who actually went out and pumped gas for like 2 weeks or whatever, came back. So what'd you learn? He goes, I learned that nobody cares about what's in the gasoline. Like you might as well create like colored air for the tire. And Howard goes, that's what we'll do then. So he created an ad that says, Fina gas stations, we have this new product, pink air for the tires. And we want to send you a sample of it. Of course, we can't send air through the mail. So we're going to send you a pink balloon. And when you look through it, you'll see what the pink air looks like. And we'll send one for each kid. By the way, how many do you have? So people filled out the coupon, said how many kids they have. Fina knows where all the families are to open up the gas stations, right? And like, that's propaganda, right? I mean, that's Edward Bernays style. That's indirection. I'm like, people went and bought more gas from them because of this. That is advertising as propaganda.
The distinction that you made of Bernays as this person who, primarily manipulates public opinion through either pulling the levers of these key decision makers in subcultures or manipulating the press, but he never really got advertising. Like he did do it, but it's not the stuff we talk about, the stuff that's super impactful from his campaigns. And the idea of Gossage kind of sitting on top of him as the next generation's contemporary, where he's using a ton of the same techniques and he's pulling a lot of the same levers, but he's directly manipulating them through advertising is super interesting. The other thing that jumps out at me at looking a lot of his stuff is like Bernays is such a modernist. Like he firmly is a byproduct of World War I. He has very strong beliefs and primarily they're about the ideas of control. He doesn't really believe that much in individuals. He's kind of dismissive of them as a single person. And I feel like Gossage also sits on top of him in this really interesting postmodern lane. Like he understands advertising and he knows his audience understands it. And a lot of his stuff is playing with that expectation. He's directly acknowledging, you're seeing an advertisement. I'm going to fuck around with that space between the two of us and create something salient in that. Which is a very cool kind of evolution of Bernays' thinking.
Oh, that's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah, it is an evolution of it because it's like, how do I take Bernays' thinking and apply it to advertising so that, and again, with Howard's belief that the content, the ad needs to be more interesting than the medium, that's the real competition. It's not other ads. It's the medium in which it's appearing. If I can't hide that it's an ad, then I have to at least make it entertaining. And the best way to do that is a kind of like an irreverent style, sort of recognizing that the whole thing is kind of like a theater of the absurd.
I feel like he does a really good job of balancing the levity of what he's making with what he's talking about. When he starts switching into environmentalism, it feels like this absurd self-awareness we're talking about kind of falls away. And it starts focusing on a lot more traditional propaganda techniques of, the Grand Canyon one that comes to mind for me of his messaging point of, should we flood the Sistine Chapel next so you can see the ceiling more closely? Kind of indistinguishable from government propaganda, trying to rapidly have someone have a very strong opinion through a straw man fallacy. Like it's pretty directly tieable to propaganda. If you look at like Red Scare propaganda from America, there's a very similar messaging ideal there of let's take something sacred and apply the same logic to generate this really salient idea.
And it wasn't even true. They weren't going to flood the Grand Canyon.
Incredible.
I think the important thing to remember is that with Howard, it's not just about style. Like, for example, if you were to go into ChatGPT and say, create me an ad for ice cream in the style of Burnback, it would maybe come up with something pretty close. Style of Ogilvy, it would, style of Gossage. Can't do it because it's a certain different level of thinking that's being combined here. It's not just a style. Like, yes, Howard Gossage, he had a writing style, very journalistic writing style. And, but what you can't copy his headlines because his headlines are ideas. You know what I mean? Like they're PR ideas, they're propaganda ideas. The ad is just the mechanism in which he is getting it out there. So like when the Scientific American wanted to attract advertisers and pick the airline industry, and then so he created the Great American Paper Airplane Contest. So, the headline was Great American, like his headlines didn't need to be always so sensational. Sometimes they were like pretty plain. Like it's not the style. It's the idea. Right. And so like, that's the whole point of, Gossage. It's like, what can I do that's, playful to get that earned media?
Yeah. I'm most fascinated by, and I feel like it's I see so much alignment in the way we think. And I think specifically that point of the ad platform where it's like, it's lame to advertise a product. It's fun to advertise an idea and get people excited about the idea. And it becomes like almost like a two-move chess move to eventually get to the sales and all of that has always been attractive to me. And again, sometimes hard to sell to the clients, for sure. And you got to attract the right clients, but, yeah, definitely revolutionary for sure. And I think like in this age we have now where tools like AI or any other form of technology allows us to do certain forms of execution faster, it makes it so that you can do, potentially we'll get to the future where everybody can do Barbie movie, right? Everybody can do the thing where I'm just going to go make something cool and it's going to benefit our brand. And we open up like a lot of possibilities that are a little bit harder for more mid-tier or small businesses to compete in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There's one piece when even talking about Bernays and Gossage, one thing about propaganda that is a kind of a flip side that always troubles me. Eric Hoffer, the true believer, What Eric Hoffer says about propaganda is that propaganda doesn't convince anybody of anything. Propaganda is meant to rally the people who already believe that, whether it's subconscious or conscious. Real propaganda, and the reason why propaganda has a dirty word is because when I go and I look and I say, oh, that's propaganda, boom, it's not going to convince me of anything. If I went through COVID not wearing a mask, if I was an anti-masker or anti-vax person, there's not a single bit of propaganda. Anything that I would see as propaganda was not meant for me, right? It was meant to rally the bases. So you see that a lot. Like you'll see a really, really good, clever campaign where like they trick somebody in about smoking or this or that. And you'll see like, or, you know, like beating women or, you know, like anti-wife abuse and like. But none of those campaigns ever do anything to actually change behavior. It's just reinforcing. And so Eric Hoffer, like that's what he refers to as propaganda. So, but my problem with that is that I was like, well, Eric, and I'd say like, Mr. Hoffer, what you're seeing there is bad propaganda because real propaganda you don't see. For example, I was very curious. I said, what was the most successful campaign during COVID to get people who were anti-vax to take the vax? Because there was no campaigns going the other way, right? So what was the most successful? And I did this research and I discovered there's this one campaign that was in some town in Michigan or something like that, where they took people who were anti-vax and interviewed them, almost like an Apple Switch ad. You know, I used to be this and now I'm this. And that had the highest success rate, which makes sense because you're hitting somebody from a position with somebody who used to be them, right? And that from a familiar place, you're not hitting them with facts or this and so it's a good example of how advertising can be used for propaganda. Although I would say that it is a much harder thing to do. I see this now too and I don't want to get political, on it, but Israel has a very hard time with public relations, and Hamas, they have a much easier time with public relations. And one of the things that you saw after October 7th is you see, and to this day, you see a lot of Israelis, they write these posts like, let me tell you something, let me this, let me, fact. Here's a picture of a burnt baby. Not realizing that those are going to rally the base for sure. If you're Jewish or Israeli or whatever, you're going to be like, but really does absolutely nothing to convince anybody who's either on the fence or on the other side of going your side one way or the other. And why is Hamas able to do that? Right? Because they're taking an underdog position. Most people see themselves as an underdog. They're taking, right? They listen. Right? The CIA has 5 rules for persuasion: never argue, never criticize, never present facts and numbers, always tell a story, and never shock people. And that's the difference, right? Like some advertising is just, and there are many roles of advertising. Some advertising is just meant to inform you, right? And hit you at a different level of the funnel. I already like this type of tea. It's on sale, so I'm going to get more of it. But if your role is to actually change behavior, then the best bet and the best way of doing it is by combining it with propaganda.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a very, very interesting train of thought. There's a lot you covered in there. The thing that I got immediately stuck on that's so interesting is this idea of like propaganda can't shift behaviors or beliefs. It can only galvanize them in a populace. And I'd say that the distinction that requires that allows Bernays and Hoffer to fit together is separating a population into high agency and low agency individuals. I think that when let's talk about like the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, right? Yes, there was probably a 25 to 30% of that population was prepped and ready for a blood and soil narrative grounded in anti-Semitism. But we know that 70, 80% of Germany ended up going along. Flag that is not a legitimate statistic for anyone who's listening to this. Do not go and quote that. But the majority of people allowed and went along with the Third Reich. And I think that you have to examine it from that standpoint. If we rewound the clock on COVID, Would Republicans be virulent anti-maskers and anti-vaccine just out the gate if they weren't told your belief system that you have aligns with this? If they didn't see the majority of conservatives start aligning themselves with that belief system? And I think it's important to make sure you're separating those two, because a very large swath of a population is just waiting to be told, am I on Israel or Palestine's side based on already who I am, based on all of the values I have and the whole makeup I have? Where is the public opinion telling me I should automatically lean or move? And then the other one that I think does trans affirming care for kids is one that I think constantly we're seeing the right hit these really strong 1-2 punches on just cognitive dissonance propaganda, where you're a mom with a heart of gold. We're not going to tell you that trans kids shouldn't get gender affirming care. We're going to start talking about kids who are losing out on sports scholarships. We're going to start talking about, trying to align trans people with pedophiles. Those are beliefs that are like, well, I don't like pedophilia. So now you're making me resolve this cognitive dissonance in my mind. And I think that's where you can quickly move people, is when you start IDing values they already hold and then creating a positive or negative movement with a new value, applying it to that one.
Sure. Yeah. And that's the same thing that advertising does.
Yep.
Right. Eugene Schwartz says this: advertising does not create desire. It takes an already existing desire and points it towards your product. The creation of desire is education, and that's 10 times more expensive and takes longer. There's not an ad on the planet. There's a great interview with George Lois where somebody says, asks him a question about whether or not advertising manipulates people, and he goes, I wish I was that good. He goes, nobody in this business is that good. That's not what advertising does. So it's like, oh yeah, I didn't need this Apple computer. I could have just got any computer, but I got an Apple computer because of the advertising. No, that's not that, right? The desire for a luxury computer that works and looks this way already existed in you. It took that and pointed it towards this.
This is DoubleThink, conversations inspired by the themes of This is Propaganda. Your hosts are Josh Belhumeur and Malcolm Critcher. This is a production of Brink. You can learn more at brink.com.